Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. It's a huge show tonight. There's a lot around here and overseas. Let's take a look at what's coming up in the program. Labor continues to fumble on immigration and national security. Reports today that more than 60,000 failed asylum seekers, so they're not refugees, won't go home, staying in Australia, and they're working and studying on bridging visas. And you won't believe how few people have actually been deported. The latest warning from the Australian energy market operator, highlighting the ineptitude of Labor's energy policies as the nation faces blackouts and a costly bill to get electricity resources up to scratch. And it's going to get a lot worse come summer. Perhaps that's another reason why the Prime Minister's looking at an early election. Chris Uhlmann's just returned from a trip up north working on a new project. He says it's absolutely critical to Australia's future security. He joins me tonight to tell us more. And as the International Criminal Court seeks to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister and the Defence Minister of alleging war crimes, US President Joe Biden has stood beside his ally, which is more than can be said for our own Prime Minister.
Let me be clear. We reject the ICC's application for arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas.
Well, I don't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone court processes globally, of which Australia is not a party.
My view is that Australia should stand shoulder to shoulder with President Biden, and he's shown the strength of leadership to stand up against this equivalence, which is completely and utterly repugnant. This action is anti-Semitic, and it is against the interests of peace in the Middle East.
We will stay with that issue. The decision and announcement today by the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor to seek arrest warrants against the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence Minister, supposedly for war crimes, is a clear case of moral derangement.
No foot soldier, no commander, no civilian leader, no one can act with impunity. Nothing on earth can justify willfully depriving human beings, including women and children, babies, the old and the young, of the basic necessities required for life.
Now, true, he's also seeking arrest warrants against 3 senior leaders of Hamas, but they're underground and they are in hiding, and they're not democratically accountable in the way the 2 Israelis are. As far as the International Criminal Court's concerned, its prosecutor at least, there's a moral equivalence between the democratically elected government of Israel waging a just war against the terrorist enclave pledged to its extermination, and the Hamas leadership that unleashed a barbaric, depraved and unprovoked attack on Israel and is still holding upwards of 100 Israeli hostages. A clear inference of this decision is that there's no right of self-defence against an enemy that uses civilians as a shield, because significant civilian casualties constitute a potential war crime. As Israel's PM Bibi Netanyahu said today, this decision is the equivalent of equating Osama bin Laden with George W. Bush.
Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace.
Or Churchill and Hitler. For once, US President Joe Biden was on the money when he called it simply outrageous. Because if it's backed up by the court itself and accepted by most nations, it will mean that any democracy defending itself against a ruthless aggressor will fight with one hand tied behind its back. Any democracy accepting this latest concept of international law will be forced to hold back, even in an existential struggle against a terrorist organisation. This decision to seek war crimes arrests against democratic Israelis shows how biased international institutions have become, dominated by what once were third world countries and swayed by China. Here is senior Republican Senator Mitch McConnell on the kangaroo court that is the ICC.
The ICC has succeeded only in discrediting itself even further as a rogue kangaroo court utterly untethered to morality or justice.
How weak too many in the West have become. After momentary outrage against the October 7 atrocities, there's been constant criticism of Israel, even though the Israeli military have done their utmost to minimise civilian casualties, despite the practice of Hamas, who deliberately put weaponry and combatants in schools and hospitals. Ultimately, we have to be clear who's to blame for the killings in the Middle East. There was a ceasefire on October 6. Hamas broke that on October 7. And the only reason there's not a ceasefire now is because Hamas refuses to give up any and all of its hostages. It refuses to accept Israel's right to exist, and it insists on a new Holocaust with Palestine due free from the river to the sea. That's why the PM's silence on this today was so contemptible.
Well, I don't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone court processes globally, of which Australia is not a party.
Do you agree with Joe Biden's comments? And is it?
I just answered the same question.
That's gutlessness in a hard hat. I mean, surely he realises there's a difference between a terrorist group and a democratic government fighting in self-defence. And if he doesn't realise that, does he realise that if the court does issue these warrants, Australia would be obliged to arrest the Israeli PM should he come here? Yet again, Albanese is showing voters that he's just not up to the job of Prime Minister. His judgment's poor, he lacks moral courage, and today he was shamefully weak at a time when the world needs leaders of strength. Other issues too, and so this one rolls on. The slow-motion train wreck that is Australia's energy policy just gets worse. Today, the energy market operator warned that blackouts were likely this summer because we can't rely on intermittent, weather-dependent power to keep the lights on. Yet because of the Albanese government's emissions obsession, that's precisely what Australia is stuck with. An effective moratorium on new gas and coal projects and a complete reliance on wind and solar with battery backup, even though that can't run a modern industrial economy on a grid that's held together with the equivalent of Band-Aids and super glue. Even if it were worth doing, which it's not, because it's a recipe for economic disaster, the so-called transition that this government's so fixated upon, well, it simply isn't happening. We're still reliant on coal for 60% of our total power. And at different times in the course of any 24-hour period, often 100% reliant on coal, because coal is cheaper than gas and it's available 24/7. We're still reliant on coal for 60% of our total power. As I said, this is madness. We're subsidising wind and solar to reduce emissions. We're subsidising coal to keep the lights on. We're subsidising consumers because Australia's electricity prices have gone through the roof. I mean, where's the money coming from? If this whole subsidy merry-go-round had never started in the first place, we would still have cheap, reliable power. And in the normal course of events, unsubsidised power companies would have upgraded Australia's coal-fired power stations to reduce emissions by some 40%. Because that's how much better the new coal-fired power stations are compared to the old ones we currently have. Instead, we've got Labor's fanciful claim that renewables are cheap because wind and solar are free. Well, ask yourself this. Are you paying more for your power bill now than you were 5 years ago? Of course you are. As well as being hit as a consumer, you're also being hit as a taxpayer. Snowy 2.0, well, that was supposed to cost $2 billion and be done and finished in 5 years. Well, it's now costing us at least $12 billion, and it will take 12 years if it ever happens.
I don't think Snowy 2 will ever generate a megawatt of power.
Excuse me?
I don't think it will ever generate power. That's my personal view. And by the way, recently I was at a conference and I discussed with a number of energy experts, and I wasn't alone in that assessment.
Every new power project except for rooftop solar is subject to delay due to farmer protests in the case of new transmission lines and large-scale solar, conservation protests in the case of new wind turbines in pristine bush and along our coastline, and green lawfare in the courts in the case of new gas fields. We are a fossil fuel energy superpower. We're not a renewable energy superpower. And because we will never have as much wind or solar as everybody else, I mean, everyone can claim wind and solar, but not anyone, no one other than Australia can claim the coal, the gas and the uranium in the volumes we have here in Australia. Now, I know you get it. Our problem is the government does not. All right, we'll go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
The Prime Minister accused of selling out Australia as a fighter-ups over Israeli war crime warrants. The top prosecutor for the International Criminal Court is seeking charges against Benjamin Netanyahu, his defence minister, plus 3 Hamas leaders.
No one can act with impunity.
The US president called that comparison outrageous.
Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas.
Back here at home, the Prime Minister isn't willing to weigh in.
Well, I don't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone court processes globally.
It's a rare public point of difference with Australia's closest ally.
Do you agree with Joe Biden's comments? And is it
I just answered the same question.
I very strongly support the comments of Joe Biden. Either the Prime Minister's not across the detail or he's trying to please a domestic audience here for political purposes. Either way, he's selling out Australia.
France and New Zealand also broke ranks with the United States.
New Zealand's a country that respects international law. The ICC plays an important role in making sure that people are adhering to international law.
Telstra to axe 2,800 jobs, or nearly 10% of its workforce, by the end of the year. CEO Vicky Brady announced a reset for the telco in a bid to save $350 million. Telstra blamed cost of living pressures and artificial intelligence for the job cuts.
The actions we are announcing today are difficult, but they are necessary. We need to be a more efficient and sustainable business.
Well, I think this is a very distressing day for a lot of people who've received this bad news today from Telstra. And we're thinking of all of the families who are impacted.
And 2 military planes deployed to rescue hundreds of Australians stranded in New Caledonia. Around 300 people have registered with DFAT for assistance after being caught up in the week-long riots in the French Pacific Territory. The first plane left for Queensland this afternoon. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Look, I want to come back to our headlines in a moment with political editor Andrew Clennell, but there's been a massive border protection file exposed today that I want to draw to your attention first up tonight. As reported in the Daily Telegraph, Australia currently has over 80,000 failed asylum seekers in the country, so they are failed, they've been assessed, they are not refugees, and they are refusing to return to their home countries. Now, of the 80, we learned today that 60,000 of them are on bridging visas, which give them the rights to work and study in this country. Now, how many has the federal government been able to deport out of this 80,000 in recent months? How many? Just 17. For more on this, I'm joined now by Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Dan Tehan. Dan, thank you for your time. I mean, I had to put this at the top of the show. 80,000 failed asylum seekers, a lot of them that came, of course, in the Rudd-Gillard years, but they've come since then. These are outrageous figures, and of course, so many of them, by refusing to go home, are living on the largesse of the Australian taxpayer.
That's right, Peter. We found out through asking questions on notice that of those 80,000, 60,000 have work rights and study rights. And the question that the Prime Minister needs to answer, because once again Andrew Giles has gone into hiding, is what is he doing to remove these people from the country during a housing crisis, during a rental crisis. It seems that he's quite content for this 80,000 to be part of the 1.67 million, which is more than the population of Adelaide, that have increased our population or will increase our population over the next 5 years. And as you've said, as you know, we've said that we're going to lower the rate of immigration in this country, and that's one of the cohorts that we're going to look very closely at.
Yeah, interesting you make mention there. Andrew Giles is in hiding, but the Prime Minister, he was pushed on this today. This is what he had to say.
We're addressing the migration issue, we're addressing the housing issue, we're addressing all of the challenges that are before Australia in a considered, orderly way. That is something that has characterised my government.
I'll listen to the sort of campaign messages from your leader and the Prime Minister today. The Prime Minister on the side of Big Australia. Your boss is saying, no, we don't need Big Australia, we need a better Australia. Jim Chalmers, when he was out and asked about it all, he was almost hysterical about the billion-dollar budget impacts that would come if migration was cut, which amplifies, I think, the point you've been making, Dan, that this is all designed just to pump up their budget. They couldn't give us stuff about the impact of all these people out in the community. But interestingly, you've got the support today of the Labor Premier in Queensland, Stephen Miles. He's backing the coalition's push. We saw in polls yesterday, so do the majority of voters. I mean, this will be, I think, a huge issue come the campaign.
Of course it will, and we set about making sure that we're doing the policy work so that there will be a very clear choice for the Australian people at the next election. And one of the clear choices they're going to have is, do they want to back Anthony Albanese and his Big Australia approach, remembering that Big Australia approach has seen nearly 1 million people come in the first 2 years of the Albanese Labor government, or our lower immigration, putting Australians first when it comes to getting them into houses, when it comes to lowering their rents. That will be a clear difference at the next election.
We saw figures out today. The University of Sydney, it has posted a $1.5 billion revenue, nearly $400 million of profit, but revenue of $1.5 billion. This is largely, of course, off the back of international students. Now, given that, do you think Labor's got the guts to wean our universities off foreign students?
I don't think they do. I think as part of their Big Australia approach, they've been quite happy to see the numbers of international students just grow and grow. And Sydney University now, some people in the education sector say that they have more than 50% of their students are now international students compared to domestic students. Now, that just shouldn't be the way or the approach that universities take. The focus needs to be on domestic students. And I mean, my view, and I think the view of most Australians, would be that any figure higher than 33% is just too high when it comes to the proportion of international students versus domestic students. And they're making huge sums of money as a result of this. And of course, that's not going back into housing domestic students and helping ease the rents for domestic students. So this is why we've been very clear that we want to look at this, and especially look at universities like the University of Sydney and how many international students they're bringing in.
Dan, of course, before you went into the Parliament, you were in a diplomatic role. I've got to then ask you about the International Criminal Court, the ramifications today about arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. The Prime Minister today refused to even address the question. He drew, I think by lack of answer, a moral equivalence between the Hamas leadership and the Israeli leadership. He attacked Peter Dutton, though, at the same time, accusing your leader of lacking moral courage. Where is Anthony Albanese's leadership here?
Well, there isn't any, and it was a sad, sad day for our nation. Joe Biden came out very clearly and said that there is no equivalence between Hamas and Israel. As someone who has been to Israel recently, been to the Nova camp where the massacre of those young Israelis took place, been to Kibbutz Be'eri, where all sorts of atrocious crimes were committed. How the Prime Minister could walk away from that comment made by Joe Biden that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel beggars belief. And I think it's a sad day for our nation. And he sort of tries to almost play the buffoon on these things. But this is a time where we need our Prime Minister standing up. And his failure to do so today, I think, will be a black mark against his Prime Ministership in the days to come.
It was Bob Hawke who said if the bell tolls for Israel, it tolls for the wider world. Thank you, Dan Tehan. He's no Bob Hawke, is he, our Prime Minister? Let's go now to Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Andrew, I know you followed this closely today. Give us your sense of the politics around the comments made by the Prime Minister today, his failure to back in President Biden. That was a gift in terms of an option, I thought. An attack from Chris Bowen then against Peter Dutton. Peter Dutton, of course, pretty robust. Where do you see things?
Well, I just think Anthony Albanese made a big mistake, and his mistake, Peter, is not to have a view, to issue a no comment. Obviously, if he issued a comment saying, Israel has some or could proceed more carefully in the way they're conducting the war, I'm sure you would be right into him, but at least then he'd have a view. And I don't think it's acceptable for the Prime Minister not to have a view on this. He's got to really avoid this. And this afternoon we saw a statement out from the department, DFAT, on this. And that's just a massive cop-out. And he's got to be very careful about, I think we've seen this now on a couple of occasions. So, one of those Chinese incidents, we've seen a defence statement, for example. This isn't state government where you do things like that. You let the department take out the bad news. He's the leader of the nation, and we have a right to hear what he thinks, and he should have an opinion about an issue like this. It emerged hours before the press conference. Now, I think his view would be this ICC thing isn't helpful, that Israel could proceed with more caution during the war, but that the Hamas leaders should be brought to account. I think that would be his view. What's wrong with expressing it? And I do think it does feed into this sort of conspiracy idea that Peter Dutton has, which is that he's trying to protect votes in Western Sydney. He's in Western Sydney when he's talking about this. It's front of mind. I think Dutton may have a point that he's treading cautiously because he's worried about votes in that area. Well, I'll tell you what else loses your votes. Sitting on the fence and not looking like a leader, Peter. That loses your votes. And
I also worry on some of this, is he actually across the detail? We saw it, it's 2 years ago since they were elected. We saw it in that campaign. It wasn't just a one-off. You hit him with questions at some time, so did Trudy McIntosh, others as well. It wasn't across the detail. And you can't be a fence sitter on something as important as this. Chamberlain famously sat on the fence, as we'll all remember, and Churchill was the one who said, I will not be impartial between the fire brigade and the fire. How can he be impartial between Hamas and the democratically elected leadership of Israel?
Well, I do wonder whether his staff got a bollocking after this, even though he should be on top of it as well, because he should have just been ready for the question and had some form of an answer. And we saw Rishi Sunak put out a statement saying that the ICC thing wasn't helpful. It wasn't as strident as Joe Biden, but what would have been wrong with something like that? He'll get asked about this again, and he better have a better answer, would be my suggestion to him. I will say this about Peter Dutton. You never die wondering what he's thinking. And I think there's a bit of a contrast there, and it's one Albanese needs to be wary of.
He does need to be wary, because I think that's what's attractive to voters at the moment. It's the clarity they used to get with John Howard. It often came up in focus groups. I don't really agree with Howard on this, but I know where he stands. I can anticipate where my government might go in some of the big questions. as he's getting around, and I was saying this last night, I mean, this is a prime week post-budget. They get out and sell, particularly on the government side, what they've just brought down. A lot of detail comes out on the Tuesday night. They want to make sure it hits home with small business and families. But there's a lot of talk about an early election. We discussed that last week. And then you look at where the Prime Minister's travel pattern is moving. A lot of Labor seats are in his focus. Now, that says to me he's in a very defensive mode. You know, he's in sandbagging mode. He's not offensive. He's not chasing seats that are in the ledger of Peter Dutton. He's looking like he's trying to protect his own. I suspect after the Voice, this is still important for Labor.
Look, I think that's right, but I saw my friend Jeff's take on that. I would point out the government has 78 seats and Peter Dutton has 55, so it's hardly surprising that he's trying to sandbag, that he's visiting his own seats. He has more seats after all. And if you look at it logically with the national numbers, there's really only 3 or 4 he could possibly hope to pick up. So they are after a status quo result, and he's needing to work hard in the 78 seats that he's got not to slide into minority government or worse.
Let's talk about Chris Minns just briefly. I've watched him closely on the issue of social media, quite prepared to go it alone. I think he's pitched that very well to households. He gets where families are on this issue. He's not waiting for smoke signals out of Canberra. He's also pretty strong on the issue of energy. He's out there about Eraring. It's 25% of New South Wales power, about or set to close. It's going to obviously be extended. He says the public will lose support for renewables if Eraring closes prematurely and there are blackouts. And he's spot on, isn't he? He reads the politics well.
Well, it's a very interesting observation. I think you don't like anyone in Labor, but if you did, it'd be Chris Minns, Peter, I've got to say, because he's a pretty conservative character for a Labor politician. It's in that tradition of the New South Wales right. And it's obvious the solution, at least for 2 or 3 years, is to extend Eraring. I think it's 2.8 gigawatts. The EMO report said it was 1.5 gigawatts short over 26, 27, 27, 28. So they will pay to extend it. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But he does seem to take a path right down the centre on a lot of issues. And I think he's performing quite well, frankly. I think it's a tough task for the New South Wales Liberals in the years ahead, as long as he's there. Look, he hasn't got the world's best cabinet, but he wouldn't be the first state leader to be in that situation. They used to talk about the Victorian government as Kenneth Stockdale, and that was it, right? So it's kind of that same scenario in New South Wales. On social media, this is a really difficult one. I applaud his sentiment, but I wonder if he's sort of portraying he can do something he can't do, because for anyone with teenagers, we all know that the horse has bolted, really. The moves should have been, I mean, they should try and do something, but just to ban it for under 16s, good luck with that. That should have been something that occurred years ago that government should have addressed, frankly.
Yeah, and I don't know how they do it. I mean, they've got the bans on websites if you're under at the age of 18 and it's an alcohol website. You just click through that. You just assert you are, and you still get through to the website. So there's one thing to ban it, and there's the other thing to be able to enforce the ban. And I think Paul Murray made this point last night. I completely agree with him. No kid has got a phone that their parent hasn't paid for it and isn't helping to pay. So parents have to sort of step up here as much as they expect governments to step up. And my last point, I'll surprise you here, it's not just Mr Minns that I'm quite impressed with at the moment. I think John Malinowskis over in South Australia is playing the Liberals off a break. So there's 2 Labor premiers from the Labor right that I am impressed with. Andrew Clennell, you heard it here, breaking news. Peter Credlin likes 2 Labor premiers. There you go.
I wonder how they'll take
See what happens
Peter.
there. Thank you, mate. Yeah, it's probably the kiss of death from me, but anyway, doing my best to give the Liberals some sort of leg up. I'll see you next week. After the break, the energy market operators warning over blackouts. They're coming this summer, so says the regulator. So what's Chris Bowen going to do to keep the lights on? Plus, powering the nation on a wing and a prayer, Chris Uhlmann joins me as we look at the politics of power. Chris Uhlmann, he'll join me a little later on as he embarks upon a new special media project. But first, The Australian energy market operator has warned of increasing blackouts amid the nation's energy transition. AEMO's latest 10-year forecast warns of the combination of delays to green projects and the closure of traditional power sources could increase the reliability risks. That's what they say, reliability risks for households. For more on this, let's bring in the Australian's Environment Editor, Graham Lloyd. Well, it was front page news this morning in your paper. You don't get a more concerning warning than this, Graham. How did you see the news from AEMO?
Well, good evening, Peter. It's certainly concerning news on a couple of levels. What the operator is saying is that the reliability margin is reducing in the most populous states of New South Wales and Victoria, and also in South Australia. That has immediate implications for the coming summer, and they're looking for new reserves to try and plug the gaps. But probably the more concerning thing is Chris Bowen is right. AEMO has been warning about this for years and the lights haven't gone off yet. But what we can see in this report is that the flexibility in adding new supply is being constrained by a failure to expand the network. The government has been deficient in providing those network services, and there's every reason to suspect that those problems will continue. So really the train is racing towards the wall.
We've also got a lot of people up in arms about the rollout of transmission, particularly country areas. Regional Australians are getting very mobilised. There's a lot of organisations being formed. A lot of community people are agitating politicians. I mean, this is not going to be easy.
No, this isn't easy. This is the lesson from the rollout that perhaps a lot more thought should have been given to at the beginning. People are generally hostile to the industrialisation of rural communities and areas that by and large people wanted to live in peace. So there's no easy solution, but as the AEMO report shows, this is critical to delivering on what has been promised, and eventually something's going to have to give.
Is there any update on the cost? Because, you know, the cost there of the rollout was $80 billion. Well, just like dear old NBN, which is over $150 billion, was supposed to cost us under $5. No one believes it's going to be $80 billion. And of course, if it costs $80 billion, every cent of that's going to be passed on to the poor old household consumer. Do we know if those forecasts have been revised?
Well, nobody can make a valid assumption of what this is going to cost. And as you say, when it's put to the test, the costs are many orders of magnitude greater than were promised. What we're seeing with the electricity rebate and other things, the cost is being sort of taken away from the power bill and put onto consolidated revenue. With the programs that are envisaged for the future, there's no end to this cost, and I've seen estimates that are in the trillions of dollars.
Good Lord. What about Eraring? A bit of toing and froing today between the Prime Minister, Federal Energy Minister Chris Bowen, of course, and the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns. It's a huge hole if it was to disappear from the grid. We would really be talking about wide-scale blackouts. What's the latest?
Well, I think Chris Minns was making some sensible comments today that this is something that has to happen. It's been under negotiation for a period of time. I assume it's a matter of just arriving at the best price and the way it can be done. But without extending Eraring, actually solving the problems in the short term that AEMO has raised, it's very difficult to envisage. So ultimately that deal will be done, and it's just a matter of cost.
Give us an update on the battle that Chevron's waging against the Labor government in Canberra. They want more consultation over the overhaul of this environmental legislation. They say this is the next battleground between the LNG sector and the Albanese government. What's the latest there?
Well, it's an interesting space. I think the government has put the revision of the EPBC to one side while it works out how to go forward. I think we saw the compromise with the Greens last week on the offshore gas development. That gave a pretty good indication of how hamstrung the government is in this space. Chevron is sort of putting up the balloon that the industry is not able to deal with something that satisfies the Greens at every turn, and they're fearful of things like environment trigger based on emissions being put into the EPBC, so everything would have to be judged on its climate impact. That will gum up and frustrate all fossil fuel developments into the future. This is where the Greens want to go, and the industry is alive to it.
And of course, if fossil fuels fall over, certainly in the near term, not only will we not be able to turn the lights on, but we won't be able to afford the NDIS and everything else in the budget, because it is what's pumping up the bottom line. Graham Lloyd, thank you. All right, after the break, the PM once again fails to draw a line between Hamas and Israel. We'll get into that with Chris Uhlmann. Plus, what next for Iran? The death of their president, of course, in that helicopter crash. Women were out celebrating him going under. The Butcher of Tehran was his moniker. And the latest out of the Trump trial too. Polls continue to fall for Joe Biden. My international panel coming up. Right, coming up, we'll get into the Trump trial, all the latest there. But let's get into some domestic issues if I can first. Joining me now, Sky News contributor Chris Uhlmann. I'd like to start, if I could, first on energy. I do want to get into this ICC attempt to arrest, or at least issue warrants in relation to Benjamin Netanyahu. But let's start with energy. I've just gone through the detail of that AEMO report out today with Graham Lloyd for The Australian. But the blackouts are predicted over summer. They will worsen in coming years. We've got a tanking economy, that's the fear. We're not likely to get the rate falls, the drop in interest rates that people were promised. There's a fear that they'll actually go up. Things are starting to get a little bit tougher, I think, for Australians, and they're already bloody tough. I mean, this is where I think the Prime Minister would seriously be thinking about going to the election early, don't you think, Chris?
Well, certainly if the lights are going out, Peter, you don't want to be the Prime Minister when that happens. And so if you're looking at the calendar, you'd think, well, after the Queensland election in October and before December when summer starts, so sometime in November, might loom as a good time to do it. But then again, think about it, he's probably listening to the advice of his Energy Minister. And if he's doing that, his Energy Minister is going to say, oh, look, they've said this before, that the lights would go out, and they didn't. I don't know if I'd be prepared to take that bigger risk on the advice of Chris Bowen. Don't forget that Chris Bowen was the one who came up with the policies that said by 2025, which is next year, the households will get a $275 saving on their energy bills. And he based that entirely on the idea that when you put more weather-dependent energy on the grid, that is wind and solar, that when it's running, the price is lower and ergo the price drops. Well, I questioned him about that time, and it appeared to me apparent that he didn't understand how electricity is priced on the national energy market, and that is by the highest cost of generation, not the lowest. We did see power prices spike after the war with Russia and Ukraine, but they've come down since then. But that's what pushed up bills last year. What will push them up next is the rollout of transmission lines, which is 40% of your bill, and they have a regulated rate of return. So prices, no matter what you do from now on, they might dip in the short term, but they're going to go up in the long term.
This is like when we talk, budget detail or health funding, let's say. The government's relying on the complexity of this issue. I remember when we were fighting them on the carbon tax, they would just blather on in a whole lot of detail. Voters' eyes would glaze over. They'd tick the box to say, I'm saving the planet. Yeah, I think in a poll, climate change action is a good thing. But when the rubber hits the road and it costs you a lot of money and it sends your business out the back door, that's when you realise that there's got to be a right way to do this transition and there is a wrong way to do this transition. Again, you've just gone through some stuff there I'm sure people at home didn't understand about the transmission cost now in their bill. Part of the problem here, Chris, with this issue is it's just so complex. And when the government says wind and solar are free, well, you look out there and you see it's sun shining and the wind's blowing, you think that's right, but that's not how our grid works.
Yeah, and the other thing too is we need to start to explain to people how energy systems work, and just think about what happened in the last century. When we went from coal to oil in particular, we saw an explosion of growth, the like of which we have never seen before. In the life of my grandfather, who was born in 1899 and died in the mid-1960s, he started in a house that had no running water, no electricity, and no power of any kind. And by the 1960s, he had a television, a refrigerator, all the things we imagine a modern world has. That is almost entirely due to us finding the most explosive source of energy that we've ever found, and that was oil. Our entire lifestyle has been built on it. What we're doing is going from really energy-dense sources of power, coal, oil and gas, and we're going to dispersed sources of power. What that means is that we have to completely overbuild it. So what you're going to see is we will cover the landscape, literally from sea to shining sea, overbuilding wind and solar power in order to make up for that loss of energy density. And still, even with that, we're going to have to back it up with something because it's not always available. That creates enormous costs. So don't talk about when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. Talk about the actual cost of delivering electricity. And we need to start educating the Australian public as to what that means and what it looks like.
I know you've been up north. I know you're knee deep in this energy. Well, it is a national security issue. Energy is a national security issue. I know you're knee deep in it. What can you tell us? What have you got in the offing?
Look, and we're doing a documentary. It'll go to air in October at this stage, and we're looking at the energy transition, and we're looking at it in a completely dispassionate way. We have no truck with any particular source of power, but where we are and how we're going to get to the land that is promised to us with cheaper energy and greener energy. I was at the Port of Gladstone the other day, and for those who say we will be a green energy superpower based, I think, on hydrogen, but we yet to see that. We haven't got that industry yet. We are already an energy superpower, Peter. Out of that port alone, we export 20% of the world's metallurgical coal and 25% of its liquefied natural gas. Don't forget also that one of the things that we are planning to do is to give up those sources of income. The world demands that we do that. By the way, you can't make wind turbines at the moment without using metallurgical coal because we haven't yet developed the processes for doing that. So we really need to think long and hard about the course which we have set and the costs that will impose, not just on changing electricity, but changing every single thing that we do. It's a much larger project than people would believe.
When the Prime Minister was asked today about whether he was drawing a moral equivalence, which President Biden did not draw, between Hamas and Israel on the back of the ICC's decision, he sort of said, I'm not going to comment on a court case. Andrew Clennell was scathing of that response from a Prime Minister. He says you don't get to make that call when you're a Prime Minister. You don't get to sit on the fence on something like this. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think that Andrew is right, that the Prime Minister needs to have an opinion. I would have thought that it would be easy to at least say that there is no moral equivalence between the terrorists of Hamas, the death cult of Hamas, and the democratically elected government of Israel. He also said, though, that he doesn't comment on court cases. Well, he has. He's commented on the court case of Julian Assange and has said that it's time that he comes home. And I think that's a perfectly relevant interjection by the Australian Prime Minister to ask the United States to allow that to happen. After all, Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, but he has commented on court cases, so that argument also falls down. But I will say this, Peter, there will be a reckoning with Benjamin Netanyahu because he lives in a democratic society. And I know people who in Israel who are outraged at the fact that he failed at his one major task, because he was a defence hardman, and that was protecting the people of Israel and exposing them to that attack by Hamas. And what's happened is because Hamas cares only slightly more for Palestinians' lives than it does for Israelis' lives, it was inviting Israel to do what we're seeing. It was inviting Israel to come in and to kill as many people as possible in Gaza so that the Israel standing in the world community could fall. So I think as far as Hamas is concerned, if there's not one person left alive after this war, then they'll think that that's a great outcome as long as Israel falls. So I think, yes, there will be a reckoning for Benjamin Netanyahu, but it will be from the people of Israel.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Chris. See you next week. We'll get into Julian Assange. There's been some developments there after the break, but I also say I never thought I'd say strong and Biden in the same sentence, but he has taken a very strong stand today. More on that after the break. All right, let's bring in my panel. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, former Labor MP Michael Danby. We'll start with the International Criminal Court. Australia is a member state. Others are not, like the US. They recognise Palestine, even though the UN doesn't, which is how they get the jurisdiction to put this stuff out there today. Two things here. The reaction from the free world. Australia is now an outlier. Our Prime Minister's a fence sitter on this issue. I want your reaction on that as a proud Labor man. But, I mean, what does this do to any democratic country that wants to use international law, as we should, the right to self-defence? This is now almost in abeyance. It's now threatened as a right of countries.
This is the triumph of international woke lawfare. And if Albo can't see that, then he doesn't understand the implications for Australia or any democratic society that has a natural right of self-defence. So at the very moment that the UN downgrades the number of casualties to 24,000 and the IDF has killed half of those as Hamas terrorists, that is the moment, with Amal Clooney's advice, the International Criminal Court chooses a celebrity Palestinian lawyer over all of the NATO chiefs or chiefs of the British Armed Forces, none of whom gave advice to the panel on proportionality or military necessity. So, Albo, come on, you don't realise the stick you're making for Australia's back.
I've got to ask you, I'll come back to Iran if I've got time. What's the latest in the Trump trial? Because there was admissions today from Cohen, or overnight from Cohen, star prosecution witness, that he is a thief.
So the star witness, who anybody who's been following this case knows is a convicted felon and perjurer, he delivered and was caught out in a few more lies, over the week, and the big one that he stole, skimmed off the top in the scheme that Trump is on trial for, something to the tune of $30,000, which is a pretty big number if you think of it from the jury standpoint. The big picture, though, here is that this case was never about facts and law. It's about likability, both in the courtroom and those jurors. And is there going to be one juror, even in a very biased Manhattan jury pool, who just finds this beyond the pale and dislikes Cohen more than Trump? And then beyond that, politically, it's about likability and who's coming out looking uglier and dirtier. The other thing is this is a crossing the Rubicon moment, that this is what the United States has indicted a president for in the first time in 235 years of history. For what? For this person. And that's just not a good look.
Just quickly, Julian Assange. I mean, I wish he would face the courts. I would hope they find him guilty, lock him up and throw away the key, right? He leaked secrets that put lives at risk. But they've got to bring this to a head, surely. And now he's got the right, obviously, to appeal that US extradition order. How long is this going to take?
He's effectively locked himself up in jail for years in the Ecuadorian embassy and now in Belmarsh prison because he evaded bail, didn't pay his bail. Look, this is, I mean, how many shots does this guy get? Either he should be extradited to the United States and face a fair trial there. How can a British court say that you wouldn't face a fair trial in the United States? You can insist that there be no death penalty, but I don't think he'd face the death penalty in a US court anyhow. It'd be something lesser like his mate Chelsea Manning.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you both. Sorry that was short. We had a lot on tonight. All right, we'll see you back tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew Bolt.